Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Today we're going to talk about the global economy. And I have with me, or actually here in Toronto at his own computer, Professor John Curtin, who is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. I've known him 100 years, but not real well. And we're going to get better acquainted again because I haven't seen him in several years. Good morning, John. How are you?
Well, I'm wonderful, and it's great to be with you to talk about the critical issues of the day and the days and years to come.
Indeed, we're at an inflection point, as they say nowadays. The global economy and everything else is up for grabs. And you are especially devoting your time to the study of the G7 and G20 organizations, about which I know almost nothing, but except that they are kind of the focal point of globalization. These are organizations of nations that meet every year or so, and or heads of state and heads of government and the heads of the economy and so on, and they talk about the global economy as if they could manage it. So my problem is, when I decided I didn't know enough, I ought to get smart, I consulted that font of all wisdom, Wikipedia, to find out a little bit about G7 and G20. And I must say, I was bored out of my mind. It didn't say anything interesting. It just gave me a list of names of dates when they met and people who met and that sort of thing. Didn't tell me a bit about what was worth talking about, what they actually discussed and what they decided. So I came away wondering, do these outfits really make any difference in the world? So you tell me, John, do they?
Oh, yes, indeed. They make a great deal of difference, and largely for the global good. Let's start with the G7 because it's the oldest. It began life as an annual meeting of the most powerful leaders of the most powerful democratic countries in the world. Its first summit taking place on the outskirts of Paris in France in November 1975. And some of your viewers will remember or have learned that those were dark days for the global economy and indeed for the democracy, which all the citizens of G7 countries had taken for granted, since 1945. The world then, as now, was reeling from an unprecedented economic setback. It was called stagflation. Low economic growth with very high inflation. Prices are rising all the time for food, for fuel. And one of the big reasons was because of the first oil shock in 1973, caused by yet another Middle East war. So that was just one of many shocks in that dismal half decade. Probably the first came on the Sunday evening, August 15th, 1979, when the US President, Richard Nixon, unilaterally said on television, the US dollar, the major currency in the world, is no longer as good as gold. You can't cash in your dollars, which he could print, his country, for a gold, the classic store of value. And of course, that meant the US dollar could depreciate, but also that the US central bank could just print, as it were, more dollars and fuel the inflation. The Democratic Revolution was in retreat as well because the Soviet Union was expanding. Its ideology highly attractive, its influence. And then
Excuse me, but I remember that, but I never understood it at the time, and I still don't understand it. I mean, we've survived, so it must not have been as, I remember people talking about, going off the gold standard as something that would ruin the world. Yeah, tell me about that. I don't understand the logic of it. Was it a good idea or a bad idea, what Nixon did?
It worked when it was invented, the formula at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, where we created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the pillars, the first ones of what we call today the institutions of the rules-based international and liberal internationalist order. So the gold standard was gone. The US dollar, the great victor of the Second World War, the best economy, producing just over half, all alone, of the goods and services in the world. So wow. Who would not want US dollars? But the US said, with memories of the vast inflation in the 20s that created the Great Depression, Weimar Germany, and the Second World War, no, we can't go all the way to, just printing more money. We've got to have an anchor, and gold was a traditional one. Hence, the regime was linking the US dollar to the old gold. But on August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon said in an extraordinary speech, we've won the war in Vietnam, and the boys are coming home in victory, and they need jobs, but the jobs aren't there because foreigners are taking advantage of us. They have low exchange rates, so people are buying their cheap products and not high-priced American ones. So I need the freedom to devalue the US dollar, but that means I have to break the link with gold. So that's what he did. And then if we flash forward just 4 years, April 30th, 1975, when the United States lost its longest war until then. And all of your viewers who have seen that great musical and movie, Miss Saigon, will know the trauma it imposed on the United States almost to this day. So in response to all of these setbacks, Henry Kissinger, who was the real designer, strategist of the US foreign policy, said, I need a new institution to defend the democratic powers. And that's why he said yes when the leaders of France and Germany called the G7 leaders to that first summit. And if you read what they decided, what they were able to put on paper, there was a great deal about, yes, governing the global economy. But there was a lot of other things. The one that stands out, I think, today, they committed themselves to energy conservation, exactly what we need now to help win the war in Ukraine. They also said what their new international institution was committed to, the defining of principles. One was to protect within its own countries, but to promote globally the values of open democracy, individual liberty, what the French and the Americans call it, we in the Anglosphere elsewhere tend to call it human rights. The third was social advance. So it wasn't just to deal with the economy narrowly defined. It was about everything.
Mm-hmm.
Security, society, the economy, but ecology as well. That's what energy conservation is all about.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then there was a period when they admitted the Russia as a nice greeting card to Yeltsin, I think, right? Did that make any difference in the way the G7 functioned, or when it became G8?
Very much. The G7 summits continued to meet to galvanize the major democracies to counter the new Cold War, we call it, Russian expansion. It was then the Soviet Union. It invaded Afghanistan, that you remember, but had been defeated in about 1986. And the then leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, on July 16th, 1989, sent what was really a surrender letter on behalf of the Soviet system. Where did he send it? Not to the White House, not to the UN. He sent it to the G7 summit leaders meeting in Paris.
No kidding. I didn't know that. Interesting.
So he knew where the center of global governance was. And then soon after,
and that was his, excuse me, that was his statement that he was going to withdraw the Soviet troops.
That had been happening before. Most of his letter was, I want into the West. I know your economic system works, which means his doesn't. And I want to economically cooperate with you. But when you make that first big transposition, it was perestroika and glasnost, all right? The perestroika was the economic restructuring. Yeah. The glasnost was the openness, transparency, democracy, we generally call it. So a few years later, the United Kingdom hosted the summit in London, and they invited Gorbachev to have lunch right after with the G7 leaders. And he said, look, I need help.
Yes. Now he wanted many trillion, like almost $1 trillion, right? Many $1 billion that he needed at that point. I think that was one of the worst decisions that, frankly, if they'd given him that money, I think he'd have saved the Soviet Union, and I don't think we would be in the war in Ukraine today.
It depends which Soviet Union we wanted him to save. Yes, they probably should have been a little bit faster and more fulsome in the support they provided, but that got the ball rolling.
They didn't give him much at all.
Not in the beginning, but year by year, he got more and more. And then flash forward to 1998, when he was admitted as a full member to the new G8. The G8 with Russia.
That would have been Yeltsin, not Gorbachev.
Right, then it was Yeltsin. Now that's right, because the Soviet Union had disappeared. And I think that's an extraordinarily good thing. If you ask East Germans today, would you rather be living still as part of the Soviet Union under Mr. Putin, or as part of the United Democratic Germany under Chancellor Olaf Scholz? Almost all of them would say, what a crazy question. Yes, we're proud to be part of a reunited Germany, which is now in the lead in fighting for freedom in neighboring Ukraine. There would be no Ukraine if the Soviet Union still existed.
Well, that's true, but well, we could have a really good debate about that because the question is who broke up the Soviet Union? Gorbachev. He's always being blamed for it, but in fact, he was making huge progress. If we had a democratic Soviet Union, wouldn't you rather have that than these separate countries that are all autocracies?
Yes, I would, but we have to remember that Gorbachev was never a personally committed Democrat. Yeltsin was. So,
oh boy, now we're going to have a huge fight about that, John Curtin. I tell you, this is one of my big issues. I think Gorbachev was the most democratic person, well, certainly the Soviet Union ever had, and Yeltsin was I can't find the right word without saying an inexcusable kind of language. Anyway, okay, we are going too far afield from our real discussion. I've led you astray. So go back to where we started, because otherwise you and I are going to have a fight.
As long as it's an intellectual one, that's fine. So where do we go from here?
We want to go back to, I want to know what the structure of the G8 is. And also, we haven't even started talking about the G20, which it came much later. And I don't know, I gather it was kind of a sop to placate countries that felt left out when they shouldn't have been. Anyway, we can talk about the G20, but I want to know about how decisions are made in the G7, which it is again, it's not the G8, and how, because as I understand it, there's certainly no enforcement of any agreements. Do they have any kind of policy of reaching any kind of consensus, or is this all just an opportunity for people to get together and air their points of view, and then they go away with as much diversity as they came in with? Or is there any kind of effort to create a global policy that would in any sense be maybe not binding, but at any rate have a heavy impact on global policy of all the members?
It's both. It is a talk shop, but surely it is a good thing that the most powerful leaders, the most powerful countries talk face to face. In person is possible, but even by Zoom when it's not, because they actually might learn something from one another. Oh, you did this policy to reduce unemployment in your country. Never thought of that. Maybe it fit mine. So they're all better off because they listen and they learn. And sometimes they say, oh, well, yeah, we disagree, but actually we're still committed to the same basic values. So let's put aside our third level differences and all agree to do the same thing. Does inflation cause unemployment or not was one of the big debates of the very early years. But they do make decisions.
Sorry, but let me ask you, did they reach a conclusion? I mean, I don't know the answer. Does inflation cause unemployment?
They certainly did come to a consensus. It was a bit painful that they had to kill inflation. And then you would get a better functioning market economy that would create more jobs and better jobs. And by 1984, 85, they had done that. It's called the Reagan Revolution in the United States. Margaret Thatcher was there in the United Kingdom, so she used different terminology. But by the second half of the 1980s, the U.S. economy was back and booming so much that the people of next door Canada said, hey, I want a free trade agreement with the United States so we can benefit more easily from that booming economy. So when the G7 summit was held in Toronto in the summer of 1988. One of its achievements was to get every country to say, we strongly welcome the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement. Many other things it did, but on the economic,
did everybody agree to that, or I don't I don't remember that at all. This is very strange. 1988. It's just I remember something about the Huntsville meeting, but that was a G20, wasn't it?
the Huntsville meeting. It's called the Muskoka Summit. More generically, Huntsville's up in Muskoka cottage country. That was in the summer of 2010.
Right.
And Stephen Harper was the host, the Canadian Prime Minister then.
Mm-hmm.
And his big signature achievement was to get all of his fellow G7 leaders at a time it was the depth of the global financial crisis. They were all very poor, but he got them to agree on the spot to mobilize $7.3 billion to finance to reach the 2 of the 8 Millennium Development Goals that were the furthest behind. They were on maternal, newborn, and child health, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mothers and babies dying, mostly in poorer countries. And Stephen Harper said, no, we've got to use the power of the G7, G8 it was then, with the Russians, my summit, Mr. Putin, to get this done. And with the G7 taking the first big step at Muskoka, a few months later, they went to a bigger summit at the United Nations, and that got raised up to $40 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody, or Stephen Harper's, Canada's G7 summit, right? We wouldn't have saved the lives of so many mothers and babies ever since 2010.
Well, good for him. I must say, that's not part of my memory either. And there are very few things that I want to congratulate Stephen Harper for, but I will certainly give him a good hand for having done that. Thank you for reminding me of that, because I don't think really many of us were very cognizant of that initiative, that he was behind that. Huh?
Yes, indeed. But of course, the next day they came down to Toronto for the bigger, broader G20 summit.
Yeah.
And a number of people came out to demonstrate and protest. And the way the police reacted, caught a lot of media attention, and that tends to be the dominant memory of that.
Well, yes, the thing we remember is all this kettling of people, demonstrators, and in the streets. The police behaved very badly, as I recall. Yeah. Okay, but the really important impact occurred in Muskoka and was about the health care of women and babies, right?
That was right. That was the big signature achievement, the big deliverable.
Well, now, is it kind of understood that I know they rotate, that different countries take it on each year as a chairmanship, and that they don't seem to have a head office anywhere, or I gather even a staff. You can tell me about that. But is it that whoever's going to be chairing the meeting in any given year has to develop the agenda and some bright idea that they want to promote?
You're quite right. And each year, the presidency, the chair, rotates amongst each of the 7 members. And the chair has great prerogatives in setting the agenda. And it's expected to be a success. So the least powerful member, Canada, is institutionally equal to the most powerful one, the mighty United States next door. Where else in the world do Canadians have an opportunity to actually equally tell our friends in the United States what to do?
Mhm.
And the Americans on the whole are pretty good. Sooner or later, they listen, they learn, they go along and are better off because of it.
Well, I would think it would make a lot of difference who is the government in Canada and who is the government in the U.S. at the time. Because if you had, if you have, I'm trying to think of a bad mix or a bad match.
Yeah.
But, a lot of people in Canada would have a hard time convincing Donald Trump to comply with whatever we proposed, right? I mean, things didn't go too well between him and Trudeau. But I gather that neither country was in charge of the G7 meeting during that period.
Well, you mentioned Donald Trump. The last summit Canada hosted, it was by Prime Minister Trudeau, the younger Justin Trudeau. It was at Charlevoix, Quebec in 2018. And yes, Donald Trump came, stayed the whole time, participated in most of the sessions. But then he hopped on his plane and had to fly all the way to a historic summit with the dictator of North Korea. So, that was a pretty, well, he had to worry about that, stressful. And of course, he's older, right? And when you work a hard day, a long, hard day.
You're making up excuses for what I know is the punchline. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's a description. It's the evidence. So he fired off a tweet from his plane saying, I don't agree with anything in the paper I've just agreed to, the communique. So now lots of Americans by then and Canadians and others too were used to Donald Trump tweets, and not all of them could be taken equally seriously. And the vast majority of them actually didn't represent the policy of the government or the president of the United States. So if we look at all of the other things the Charlevoix Summit, G7 committed to, and even more importantly, did the leaders go home and actually implement them within the following year? The answer is yes, they did. And the Americans did too, Donald Trump's Americans. So I do think the president at a bad moment, got his frustrations out of his system with a tweet, blaming Justin, who was far younger and more energetic and more naturally likable, right? But then the G7 still delivered. One of Trudeau's 5 priorities was gender equality. And Trump, maybe thanks to his daughter, Ivanka, they went along with that. So the Charlevoix Summit really did advance the struggle for gender equality, even in the major democratic powers of the world. Did some good things on the oceans, did some good things on fighting disinformation, and indeed,
Really?
yeah, we knew that disinformation takes many forms. It could happen from folks, well, let's say even within the United States, QAnon, or even Canada has its homegrown types of that sort. It's not all just from China or Russia, and it was the G7 that was pretty quick off the mark in trying to combat that.
Okay, so you have come up with a good list of issues that they've made decisions about, but how in the world do they, well, I don't even want to use the word enforce because I know they can't, but is there any sense of trying to pressure all the members of states to comply and to really change their actual practices to conform to, well, let's say, take the gender equality thing. What difference does it make if Ivanka tells Donald vote for support more energy in gender issues? what is the real effect in the world as it translates from a decision, a communique at the end of the meeting, into actual practices in the countries?
It's the critical question, perhaps, and that's what the G7 research group, which I founded with the Honorable Bill Graham back in 1988 when the summit was in Toronto, we measure to see if the commitments made on the sunny summit peak are actually complied with when the leaders return home to the dark valley of domestic politics, right? Do they just forget? And what we've learned is that the leaders, when they make the commitments, really do think they can comply with them, and they're really committed to comply with them. And it is a very powerful informal contract, because they're looking each other in the eye, the most powerful leaders, the most powerful countries in the world, saying, we're all committing together to do this. And if one leader defects, goes home and doesn't do it, plays the others for suckers, you bear the burden, then they know they'll meet again the next year, and all the others will look them in the eye and said, you lied, you passed the buck to us, so we can do the same thing to you, and you'll be worse off. We're all in this together. But there's a second layer. They are all democratically elected leaders of the world's biggest democracy. So these are commitments they're making not only to their only peers in the world, their fellow leaders around the table, but to the public. These are not secret agreements secretly arrived at. These are public commitments, and the public does, in varying degrees, police them. So the next time the summit gathers, the media occasionally take a look and say, oh, is it just a bunch of hot air? Did they actually keep the promises they made last year? Oh, and all the non-governmental organizations, if the commitments are on development, boy, they monitor them like hawks. Same with climate change, human rights, gender equality, so on down the line. So, and now the G7 has created over half a dozen civil society engagement groups for business, for labor, for youth, for women, and the latest one for university presidents. The University of Toronto is a major player in that one. So these engagement groups not only monitor the implementation to make sure promises made are promises kept, but they also help. They advise the leaders on what the better promises are, and even help them implement them.
Wow.
A bit. So it's not just the most powerful leaders at the top. It really is a summit of the people, or at least the non-governmental organizations that actually do speak for them, because they depend on citizens, well, giving them money, giving them time. So it's democracy, not just at the top, but all the way down. Yes, there's a lot more to do, but it's come a long way since 1975.
Well, that is very encouraging. Now, tell me, if they know before they go what the agenda is going to be, then they can do some planning ahead to figure out, okay, can we afford to pledge that we will do this for, you mentioned gender equality or the oceans or something. Can we afford to promise? What can we afford to promise? And can they go well prepared enough to really know whether when they sign something, they're signing without any basis of knowing whether they can actually fulfill it? or not? Do they have I would think that if they're really going to know in advance what they can commit to, they would probably have to have a staff of people working year round, in fact, several years in advance, to know what is available as a possible commitment.
Indeed. But from the beginning, the leaders really did not trust the big bureaucracies of the IMF to actually do the job. These leaders knew they had to do it themselves. So they appointed, they each picked a personal representative to prepare the summit on their behalf, who could actually channel the mind of the leader, get advice from him or her, and then negotiate with the fellow personal representatives at Sherpas, they're called, at Sherpa meetings. So there are draft communiques with square brackets. No, we don't agree on this. Alternative text, red lines, but slowly it works to consensus. And at the end of a summit, the leaders around a table face to face, then they all ask themselves the same question. Oh, I didn't get my favorite adjective or my favorite commitment, but do I really want to walk out before the world's media, the elite media, with this piece of paper and say, look, everybody, we failed, which means I failed, right? Because I'm one of the seven. No, they don't. And thus they don't, which is why you have some extraordinary successes. Probably one of the most successful summits was hosted by the United Kingdom by Tony Blair at Gleneagles, Scotland in 2005. And his game plan was debt relief for the poorest, aid for Africa and the poor, trade, and AIDS, the fight against the deadliest disease, infectious disease of the time, HIV, AIDS. And he mobilized on the spot, as the culmination of a great campaign, massive amounts of new money for debt, aid, not so much for trade, but AIDS as well. And the leaders actually did keep those commitments.
Okay, well, you said that you do research. Is Bill Graham also is still involved in this on the ground research?
Well, Bill is very busy with many other good causes. So you can think of him as the Governor General of the G7 research group. So he trusts young people like I to actually do the work.
Okay, well, now tell me what you do in terms of, I wasn't aware of your actual empirical counting. You do some kind of ratings system or something. How do you empirically go about determining whether these countries have fulfilled their commitments?
Well, the first thing we have to do is when they issue the communiques at a summit, and we are there, we have to identify the actual commitments they make. And that's tougher than you might think. Then once we have a list of commitments, and some summits have made as many as 528, we then pick the priority commitments, the one that reflect the heart and soul of that summit, usually about 20. And then we have a team of.
Wait a minute, hold on. I'm lost. There are 500 different commitments, specific commitments. They actually give dollar value or pounds and miles and kilograms and things.
Not all the time, sometimes, but a commitment typically is we agree to do something fairly precise. For example, we agreed to phase out fossil fuel subsidies in the medium term. Now, anybody who speaks the English language knows the medium term means about 5 years. They first made that commitment at the G20 summit in 2009. You do the math. They should have ended fossil fuel subsidies by 2014. They didn't. So that's great failure. If they had kept that just one commitment, the International Monetary Fund and many other authoritative sources say we would have cut the greenhouse gas emissions going up into the atmosphere each year by between 10 and 20%. That's a lot. We would have saved our hard-pressed taxpayers and treasuries $1.7 trillion a year.
A year.
And everybody knows that fossil fuel subsidies, they cause corruption. They harm women and babies' health. So a lot of other benefits. So very important to know, well, in the first instance, do they keep their commitments? But once we know how much, then we can ask why and find things that we can say, dear leaders, if you want to keep your commitments, cut greenhouse gas emissions, save money and lives at the same time, then do more of this. So that's the research agenda we're focusing on.
That is wonderful. That is really wonderful. If you want to do this, then here's what you need to do. Okay, what would you tell them that they should have done in order to make that early pledge real, the cessation of subsidies to fossil fuels in the near term?
What we do know is that on most subjects, if they hold a G7 ministerial meeting on the same subject before the leaders summit, then the commitments the leaders make on that same subject, say energy, is more likely to be complied with because, well, you have the best advice from your own ministers. Jonathan Wilkenfeld, can tell Justin Trudeau, yeah, this is what we want you to do, and Justin will trust them. And then, because a lot of what Justin promises would have to be done by his Department of Natural Resources, we call it, then Jonathan Wilkenfeld will, from the get-go, start doing it, implementing it, which is why it's very important to have a full suite of ministerial meetings in advance of the summit. And a word of history, the first G7 environment ministers meeting was held in 1992. So it was invented by the Germans, but it was just a one-off meeting. It only became an institution, basically, when it was held for the second time. And the host was, Sheila Cox.
Oh, really?
A Canadian invention from Hamilton.
Yeah.
And then, of course, more recently.
What was her role? I've forgotten her office at the time.
Well, she was serving as Canada's Minister of the Environment, we called it then.
Okay.
And she became, Jean Chrétien's deputy prime minister.
Yeah.
So that matters. You can think of her as the Chrystia Freeland of her time.
Yeah, right. Only more controversial, maybe even than Chrystia, but that's another question. Yeah.
True, but if we flash forward to the last time Canada hosted G7, 2018, the Minister of the Environment and now Climate Change was the Honorable Catherine McKenna. And she hosted the G7 Environment Ministers meeting in Halifax, and it was the most successful one to that time.
Oh, okay.
That, of course, comes from Hamilton. So even Hamiltonians, can do good things for global governance at the G7.
Sure. Okay. Do you feel that that people in Ottawa are listening to your recommendations? If you say, here's how to be more likely to fulfill your commitments, do this, this, and this in advance. Is there anybody up there listening?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, some of the most powerful leaders at the summit itself do refer to our work. And they basically say, and what lies behind, at the end of each summit, the leaders will say, we did great things. And the media will say, oh, yeah, right. At the beginning of the summit, the leaders will arrive. They're opening a news conferences and say, oh, we intend to do great things. And the media say, well, and right on the front pages, you didn't do anything you promised last year. And the leaders know Angela Merkel, David Cameron of recent day. They could say, oh, yes, we did, but that won't convince anybody, especially because you've got all of the NGOs, most of them saying, oh, no, you didn't do enough about my particular cause. So what Angela Merkel basically said, David Cameron, oh, don't trust me. Don't trust, an NGO. Trust the G7 research group or the G20 research group, because they really don't have a dog in this fight, right? Mm-hmm. They're the independent global governors, auditor generals, if you will. So, mm-hmm. So that's why they draw attention to our results. And boy, when we give low marks to some countries for their compliance, we hear from them, and it's a very chilly meetings that we have.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I'd love to pursue that, but I also want you to talk a little bit about the G20.
Yeah, from a Canadian standpoint, it's a historical fact. Canada didn't invent the League of Nations or the United Nations. It didn't invent the Commonwealth. So the first global governance institution that governs the global economy and now so much else was a Canadian invention.
Maurice Strong.
No, actually, it was the Right Honorable Paul Martin.
Was it?
Yeah, before he became right. He was the Honorable Paul Martin. He was Canada's finance minister. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And he looked at the growing financial crises in the 1990s and say, he went to the G7 finance ministers meeting and say, no, we need a bigger, broader group. So he had the vision, but being wise, he knew it was actually easier for Canada to get what it wanted in the world if you could talk your friends in the United States to agreeing with you and backing you. And that Paul did with the Treasury Secretary of the United States, Larry Summers.
Oh, yeah.
So Paul had the vision. Larry and Paul actually created it at the level of finance ministers and central bank governors in 1999. And then Paul became prime minister and said, hey, we really need to elevate this to the leaders level. And he talked every one of the G20 leaders into doing it except one. That was the president of the United States, George Bush.
Oh.
George didn't say no. George just didn't say yes. But then September 15th, 2008, the day that Lehman Brothers died and the American turned global financial crisis arrived in full force. And then George said, I need a summit. It's got to be a G21. And then very quickly, George W. Bush, the great resistor, chaired the first G20 summit in Washington, D.C., November 24th, 2008.
Was it actually put together in an urgent sense because of the crisis, and it wouldn't have happened otherwise? Or had it been sort of cooking all along and he just finally said, now go?
When the crisis hit, September 15th, the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors had been meeting for a decade, and they had the email chain. You didn't have to go through a big fight starting from scratch. Oh, which countries do we invite? And everybody lobbies, and maybe they won't buy your products if they're not invited, and you get a mush or a mess. So just go with what you've got, because time is of the essence, right? All the big banks were going down. All of the big three automakers were about to go down too. So bye-bye GM in Oshawa, bye-bye Ford in Oakville, bye-bye GM in St. Catharines, my hometown, and all the way down to Windsor. No, you needed to act fast, and the G7 was there, had proven its worth at the finance and central bank governors level. So George Bush listened to his finance minister and central bank governor, and he went with it. And it did enough to help contain the proliferating financial crisis. But they knew they needed to meet again quickly, and they did for the second meeting in London, England, April 1st to 2nd. Gordon Brown was the host prime minister. He had been a long-standing finance minister before. He was Paul Martin of the United Kingdom. And on the spot at the end, they walked in front of the cameras and said, we have agreed to assemble a financial package of $1.1 trillion to support the global economy. Those were really big bucks at the time. In the real material world, as Madonna would put it, but also psychologically, all right? The confidence of financial markets. Yeah.
Okay, when they have this money, how do they dole it out? What are they going to do with it at that point?
Well, the about half of the London package came from using the international financial institutions. 1/4 of it from creating at the International Monetary Fund something called special drawing rights, money that the IMF can basically create on its own. And I mention it because within the past year, the IMF has just succeeded in creating 2/3 of $1 trillion in SDRs. And now they're in the process of having the G7 countries that really don't need all of their share of it to give some of it to the poorest countries in the world who have been hit really hard.
Okay, we need to shift to the present now, because clearly everything is changing as a result of this Ukraine war and the sanctions on Russia and the changes in the sale of oil and gas from Russia. So the whole world economy is going to be is wobbling, and I wonder who's going to be holding the G8 and the next. I presume that's more important, or maybe it isn't more important. Maybe more will come out of the G20. Tell me the relative importance of these two organizations, and what do you think? Whoever's going to be hosting it next, what are they trying to put together? What should they be trying to put together to meet the challenges of this moment?
Yeah, first of all, it's not a competition between your G with your favorite number. We need both. Global problems are great and growing, so we need Gs at the leaders level to be governing them. You can't just rely on even a G7 to do it once a year when it meets in June, or wait until the end of the year in November when the G20 leaders meet. You need both, and that's what the evidence shows. This year it's the G7 first. Their scheduled summit is in Elmau, Germany, June 26th to 28th of this year. But then the latest shock hit 5 a.m. Ukraine time. Russia invaded Ukraine, and within hours, the G7 leaders met at their first summit under the leadership of Germany, the new German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. They host the G7 this year. So they were the global governance first fast responders at the summit level. And then 1 month later, a couple of days ago, March 24th, they met again, another G7 summit, this time face to face. They all flew.
Is this what Biden went to Europe for?
That's right. And it's not easy to get the US president to travel all the way to Europe. But what the G7 did on that one day, when there was a summit of the European Union leaders and the NATO leaders too, Japan is not a member of the EU or NATO. So by having a G7 summit, you brought Japan in, and it is, it is the third most powerful country in the world still. And if you look at the cadence, first summit EU, second summit NATO, but then the icing on the cake, the great capstone, was the G7 one. So 2 summits of the G7 so far this year. I do note that there hasn't been a G20 summit yet, and that's too bad. In fact, some people are even suggesting that Vladimir Putin be expelled from the G20.
Okay. Well, okay. What difference would that make? Is there any sense in which consensus is important? If so, then I would understand why you'd have to get rid of him. But if he's just going to be the odd man out, and everybody else knows what they would agree to do, and it's mostly against him, then I don't know whether that is so important to expel him. But what is going to go on there? I mean, what do these people have in mind as potential solutions to the crisis?
Well, Indonesia is hosting the G20 summit this year. And at the beginning of their presidency, they announced their 3 big priorities. One is health, COVID. It's with us still, and soaring in China, reviving in Europe, even in Canada, it's on the rise. So it is with us still. They were a pretty precedent not to declare a victory. The second is governing the digital economy. We're moving into a digital economy. That is the new source of economic growth. But the third was renewable energy, which of course is what we need to control climate change, but also to win the war on Ukraine. Mr. Putin threatening to cut Europe off from Russia's natural gas unless they give in to his demands. And
would you actually predict that the amount of change or switch over to renewables will be accelerated by this crisis, or is it just? I mean, it takes a long time to make these changes, and I worry that they can't do it in time. But tell me what you expect to have happen.
Oh, it is already reinforcing and rendering more rapid the renewables revolution. We see that every day. But could it go faster? Yes, it can. One of the international institutions, the International Energy Agency, the twin of the OECD in Paris, a week or so ago, at least a report and say, oh, look, if we just do 10 things, we can get Europe and the rest of the G7 to say no to any fossil fuel Russia wants to sell us, energy independence.
By when?
Within the year. And these things are not rocket science. So one is lower the speed limits. We did that back in the 1970s, is that right? Oh, and by the way, you drive more safely if you're going 60 kilometers an hour rather than 70. So why not? Right?
Well, yeah, but some countries are in worse shape than others, and I understand Germany is extremely vulnerable and really having to make awful compromises that they might not want to make because they're so dependent on Russian oil or gas rather, and I would imagine that if they say no to, they have said no to the Nord Stream 2, then Putin, if he really gets his back up, could say, well, we're going to cut off Nord Stream 1 then, and right now you are going to be in deep trouble. So how quickly can the rest of the world pitch in to help them get some whatever fuel they need in the short term, really short term?
It's really already happening. Several days ago, Olaf Scholz talked to Justin Trudeau, and Justin said, look, I can give you 15% of the oil that Russia does already, and other people are chipping in. We can get there. Now, we, of course, have to send our extra oil to the United States, and then the United States can send it on to Europe because we don't have a pipeline to the Atlantic yet. Then you do see Germany already instituting the first phase of its gas cutback plan. First, conservation, just use less. And summer's coming, you don't need it as much to heat your homes. And if you do many of the other things the IEA recommended, don't use your gas guzzling car on Sundays. That's not much of a sacrifice, right? And you conserve a lot. Walk or ride your bike when you can, rather than hop into your gas guzzler. 10 other, a total of 10 easy things to do. One great idea in the United States, heat pumps for freedom. Use the Defense Production Act to have all of American industry and Canadian industry too produce not personal protective equipment as we did 2 years ago against COVID, but to produce heat pumps. Flavio Volpe, the head of the Automotive Manufacturing Association of Canada, he did it for personal protective equipment, and he's willing and able to do it again for heat pumps for freedom. And the thing about heat pumps is you don't have to pay for the gas or the coal or the oil every month. Ground does the job for you.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, I think Bill McKibben was on CBC a week or so ago promoting the same idea. He said, we've got all these ships going over there with Stinger missiles and javelins and things like that. Let's fill them up as soon as possible with heat pumps and insulation and things that's going to be needed in Europe so they can quickly shift over. Terrific.
Insulation. Hey,
yeah.
I think most of our friends, and us, we have insulated our house better over the years. The British have very little insulation in their house.
That's
they insulated their house up to Canadian standards. They could save a ton of high-priced heating that comes from gas and oil and such like. So, yeah.
Well, you have made me much happier today, John. I was very pessimistic, but after listening to your account, I think there's hope. And you've just brightened my day. I can't tell you how grateful I am. So thank you very much. Yeah, it's been interesting. And carry on.
Okay. Keep going and carry on.
Okay. Bye, John.
be clever too.
Thanks. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode 431. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. When you get there to the website, look around because we have conversations going on all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.